At the Tamil Studies Conference, this presentation is going to be remarkably similar to that one. So I do apologize if you were going to be seeing this twice. So this year marks the 3rd anniversary of the end of the Civil War in Sri Lanka. It also marks the 3rd anniversary of a sustained period of diaspora mobilization from January to May 2009, when major cities around the world saw members of the diaspora, young and old, in its public spaces, camping out on the streets and chanting slogans. I present today just a small portion of one chapter in my dissertation. This isn't the entirety of it. So social movement scholars, and parts of it are kind of academic, so if you do have questions later on, I'm happy to answer them. Social movement scholars, particularly in what is known as the political process model, have pointed to 3 components of social movement formation. First, what's known as political opportunities refers to whether the political context is receptive to social movement formation and growth. In other words, does the movement have any kind of government or elite allies? Is there repression from law enforcement? Are there legislative supports in play and so on, such as freedom of assembly and the like? Secondly, mobilizing structures refers to the already present social networks and organizational resources that help organizers whenever they are in the initial stages of mobilization. So previous organizations like M2U00024, WTM, CTC are key in terms of aiding the community's mobilization in some form. And thirdly, framing processes refer to kind of the interpretive tools that are used by movements to gain support. So I'm just going to be focusing on the last one in terms of framing processes, and that occurred in the Tamil demonstrations with a particular emphasis on the LTT flag, or the Tamil flag, and the often ambivalent relationship that the Tamil youth in Canada have with the presence of these symbols at the protest. The concept of framing has increasingly become an integral part of social movement scholarship for understanding mobilization. In most cases, as scholars have noted, quote, if the combination of political opportunities and mobilizing structures affords groups a certain structural potential for action, they remain in the absence of this other factor, significant framing, insufficient to account for collective action, mediating between opportunity, organization, and action are, of course, the shared meanings and definitions that people bring to the mobilization, bring to the situation as a whole. As such, social movements are constantly engaged in what is known as meaning work, or the construction and maintenance of significant symbolic ideas and meanings, and the communication to movement supporters, enemies, and observers. So, as Noakes and Johnston and others point out, a frame, in essence, functions in much the same way as a frame around a picture. Attention gets focused on what is relevant and important, and attention gets focused away from other kinds of extraneous items in the field of view. So the construction of effective frames is not an easy task for movement leaders or organizers. During the Tamil demonstrations, for example, movement leaders could not expect, for example, that the current and potential activists knew the history of Sri Lanka, or even the historical injustices that were committed against the Tamil people on the island. A key element of the demonstrations then were to clearly articulate current events as an ongoing, quote-unquote, genocide of the Tamil people. And in this scenario, you have historical events such as the Sinhala Only Act, or the numerous riots and pogroms, or the burning of the Jaffna Library, and of course, Black July. In essence, served to undergird the frame that what was occurring in 2009 is not really an isolated injustice, but one with many precedents. Right? In this way, it should be noted the selection and emphasis of certain frames is necessarily a decontextualizing and dehistoricizing process. Certain events separated by decades, occurring under different political parties and leaders, are dragged into the heated present, stripped of nuance, and made to serve as exhibits and signposts in the injustice arguments constructed and told at particular demonstrations. In addition to framing strategies aimed at potential supporters in the Tamil community, movements often have to deal with the enormously important issue of frame resonance, right? In other words, how does the message of the movement resonate with the broader public with whom they're communicating. Frame resonance is determined by many characteristics, but for us, I'm just going to be limiting it to a discussion of the LTT flag, just to take one example, and how it became a point of contention throughout the demonstrations. According to certain scholars, frame resonance depends on two things. One, the credibility of the frame's promoters, in that credible and persuasive speakers would help the resonance of the frame that they describe. And secondly, this notion of narrative fidelity, which refers to whether the frames employed tend to mesh or draw upon the dominant culture and the target audience. The debate about the flag and how it affected the overall goal, and one of these goals being the notion of resonance with the broader public, elicited much anger and frustration throughout my research in the Tamil community and even years after the end of the demonstration. So for most of the people I interviewed, the presence of the flag negatively affected the credibility of the frame's promoters by linking everyone at the demonstrations with the LTT, which naturally began to overshadow how the broader public came to relate with the protest and the framing strategies within it. So there was also a sense that the LTT flag had no cultural compatibility or any kind of relevance to what the Tamil community was asking for from the mainstream Canadians. So the notion of cultural compatibility refers to the question of whether the symbols that are used in protests synchronize or come together with the broader cultural stock of the community that we're dealing with, or the broader mainstream community that we're demonstrating towards. The quality of relevance, of course, is the capacity of a frame to make sense of what is happening in the lives of its target audience. According to many people I spoke with, getting the Canadian public to focus on Sri Lanka itself is difficult enough without introducing the flag, a symbol which most Canadians may not have seen before, would not know how to interpret, and as such may cause them to become disillusioned with the demonstration as a whole. The flag, in other words, functioned in exactly the opposite way that a flag should, to serve as a kind of opening through which the uninitiated can be brought into the broader social movement, and connect with the movement's ideas of injustices and grievances and ultimate goals. The flag, in many ways, and portraits of Pravaran and so on, serve as a kind of self-othering mechanism, or many people I spoke to felt that it functioned as a kind of self-othering mechanism that alienated many Canadians who may have supported the Tamil demonstrations, had issues such as, or that kind of humanitarian focus, or the notion of human rights been allowed to predominate. Of course, they found the presence of human rights rhetoric as part of the demonstrations because they were there, but the question of, was that the kind of dominant narrative that was available? Most Tamil youth, as well as protest organizers, continue to express kind of deep ambivalent reactions to the presence of the flag. The flag, as prominent as it was on the streets of Toronto, was not an ideal point of entry for many mainstream Canadians. And at times, the particular frames employed at the demonstrations were not ideal points of entry, even for many Tamil youth. Right? And this is kind of a key point where it was assumed that the frames were used to communicate with the broader public, but many Tamil youth who were part of the protest themselves found it a kind of alienating symbol. So one person I interviewed, for example, pointed out that it was at the protests and through the things that she was seeing at the protests that she herself had become introduced to Sri Lankan politics, or introduced to the grievances of the Tamil separatist struggle or the Tamil human rights struggle. So while it might be surprising that people who are at the protests are encountering the themes of the protests for the first time, it is actually quite commonplace that this happens. And this notion of practice-oriented learning, or the fact of being involved in the protest as a learning experience has been, is a theme I repeatedly found in the research. So for example, when I asked one university student, what did you agree with all of the chants and the themes that were put forth in the demonstrations? She said, some of them some of them it's weird because I didn't really know how much about the leader, didn't really know much about the leader at the time. Like from the protest, I started to learn more about him, and I've read more about him since. So I didn't know if I necessarily felt that he was my leader, so that was a little difficult for me to say at the protest, right? So I really feel like if it focused more on the humanitarian aspect of the cause, if people had maybe put down the flag towards the end, things might have been better. So you do have these kinds of questions coming up. Many other respondents disagreed whether the flag was a kind of strategic mistake and argued that because it represented Tamil identity as well as Tamil people's support for the LTT, it was a fundamentally important element of the demonstration. So you did have the opposite. I don't know if this is too small for you to read, but I'll read it out loud if you follow along. One of the respondents who kind of supported the presence of the flag there said, I was wearing a t-shirt with the LTT flag on it, and some people told me to not wear it. I was like, what are you talking about? What are you guys afraid of? I'm standing right beside law enforcement. They didn't say anything to me. Yet these idiots came and said, don't wear it. Why are you doing that? If an MP doesn't want to come out because I'm wearing a flag, I don't need him to come out. Either they support us fully or they don't support us at all. I don't need this. I'll give you a little bit of cake. If someone tells me to change my dad's last name, would you change it? No, and so on, right? So for him, the presence of the flag symbolizes more. It's not something you can really set aside before you attend the protest, and he didn't really enjoy people coming up to him and telling him that it should be put aside. The issue of the flag and the various ideologies that it represents continued to be a kind of important point of debate in the Tamil diaspora, even several years after the protests were completed. As the flag represents the LTT as well as the broader ideology of the LTT, the question of whether to shed the movement's ideologies and symbols altogether following the defeat will be kind of an ongoing issue going into in Canada and elsewhere. So I've kind of briefly touched on some of these issues about the Tamil demonstrations and the framing issues. I want to conclude by asking a slightly broader question. The question of whether the protests will have some kind of long-term significance for the identity of Tamil youth. There's been much talk in the Tamil community dismissing the 5-month-long protest as largely insignificant. First, because it didn't really bring about the ceasefire that many people were asking for, and second, because it hasn't really been repeated in size or scale since 2009. But from a sociological perspective, this kind of fails to see the long-term consequences and important and the kind of emotional or social and intellectual bonds that were created on the streets of Toronto and on campuses around Ontario. The protests were not, for many people I spoke with, the protests were not a part-time event. Many of them stayed overnight on the streets of Toronto and Ottawa, holding vigils while the city slept. New friends were made, new ideological commitments and political opinions were forged, and new couples were formed as individuals met for the first time at the protest and began dating. Intimate relationships developed amidst this kind of anger and desperation of the final months of the war. So, as I argue, the demonstrations were, in a sense, a kind of moment of transference, after which the diaspora took on increased responsibility for guarding the rights of the Tamil community in Sri Lanka and holding the government to account. Despite the varying critiques expressed by Tamil youth, the presence of the flag, the feeling that many people were there just to hang out and so on, the vast majority of respondents were deeply affected by the demonstrations and were proud that they were able to come together in such large numbers and support one another. For many I interviewed, the demonstrations became a major part of their life, and some even went so far as to quit their job or drop out of school to attend. Many noted that they did not want to leave the protests and felt incredibly guilty when they eventually went home to shower or sleep. Again, this might be too small to see at the back, but as one respondent pointed out, to be honest, I didn't want to leave. There was something I really believed in, or this was something I really believed in. I was there because I'm trying to save lives. I'm thinking I have a legitimate chance and I can only act on behalf of myself, so I'm thinking me going home and sleeping comfortably in my bed versus me staying here and maybe screaming at the top of my lungs or holding a picket sign, that could be the difference between life and death of Tamils in Sri Lanka. That is why I didn't want to go home. I felt really guilty. Sorry, maybe guilty is not the right word, but I didn't have it in me. Every time I went to sleep, I would wake up thinking I could have used that time too. Then he stumbles. I can still blame myself for that little bit that I slept. Another Tamil, well, definitely just more. Another Tamil woman who withdrew from her university for an entire year recalled that it was more important for her to be there for the Tamil community in Sri Lanka during this difficult period than to kind of finish her schooling, right? As she pointed out, I think that it had far greater meaning for me to be able to help my people. This is the least I can do, and the struggle has been going on for so many years. I can't provide economically to my people, like I can't adopt a child or I can't feed 5 families, but the least I can do is voice for my people and make sure that around the world no one comes back and says, we never knew something like this happened to the Tamils, no one ever told us, end quote. When I asked whether the obvious second question, which is, did you get in trouble with your parents for leaving school, she said that it wasn't the easiest thing, but somehow to a certain point, her parents were proud to say that even though she was born in Canada, she was still kind of committed to the situation back home. So even though they were kind of uneasy about it, they were still kind of proud that she was doing it. The experience of being at the demonstrations overnight and the conversations Tamil youth had with fellow demonstrators was also emotionally significant. One woman's experience at the demonstrations reveals that new friendships were made and a sense of purpose extended into the early morning hours when less people from the general public were on the streets and media attention was of course absent. It became obvious from various interviews that for members of the community, staying on the streets of Toronto and Ottawa throughout the night was not only about raising awareness, but also about wanting to spend time with each other and have meaningful conversations, even if it was 4 in the morning and there were no TV cameras there. Her comment also reveals that how much the protests were very much a Toronto phenomenon, with the density of the Tamil population in Toronto actually helping to make the experience more significant for them. Right? When I inevitably asked, how did you get fed in the middle of the night, she laughed and pointed out, we were always fed. That's one thing. I wish we weren't, because I think that would have been more of a sacrifice we were making. We were fed really, really well. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, in between snacks and stuff, because so many places were donating food. The first youth protest we did as students was in front of the TDSB, because the high schools weren't accepting the fact that students were missing class to protest, or that there was even a genocide happening. So we did a 30-hour protest in front of the TDSB, and as soon as we're on the Tamil media saying this, we had 30 boxes of pizza arrive, we had string hoppers, we had snacks. They brought us cases of pop, and they brought us generators to keep us warm. As soon as it was youth, there was like a, oh, these poor kids type of response, and everybody brought something. Even other times, temples donated food, people would go buy food and bring it. Even on the gardener, I was fed. So one thing that was pretty clear was that the protest needed to be understood in broader terms, not just in terms of what it was set out to accomplish. And one of the ways in which we should start to look at the protest that happened is through the prism or through the lens of this notion of community resilience, right? So what the true importance of the demonstrations lies in what it actually did for the people who were involved in the demonstration, and not what it was able to or not able to accomplish. The literature on resilience is quite vast, so I'm not going to go into much of that. But the notion of resilience is taken from mathematics and describes a material that bends and bounces back rather than breaks when stressed. And this is increasingly starting to be applied to communities as a whole, and not just to kind of scientific or mathematical scenarios. So most of those I interviewed kind of recognized that while indeed aimed at raising awareness and getting help, the international community, or getting the international community to act, fundamental purpose of the protest was to help the community, largely helpless from thousands of miles away, to cope with the final months of the conflict. For example, when asked about her experience at the protests, one Tamil woman responded that many people living in Toronto had lost a lot of family and friends in the final months, and it was useful for them to come together with their fellow community members, cry and talk to each other. While she regrets that mental health professionals were not present at the demonstrations to provide support, the protest space itself allowed for a kind of public mourning to take place. As she stated, what I really liked about the protest was the way that they mobilized and the way that people came out, and they would stand there from morning till night, and like I said, it was like one big family. Everyone was so caring and the people were just very emotional. What I didn't like was the fact that I think we didn't cater to the people who were really hurt in the right way. There weren't enough people to assist them, like outreach workers for those who were traumatized, people who have been through a lot. Proper grievance strategies weren't put into play. Because there were a lot of people who would lose a lot of family members and come out the next day, they were just really upset. They were really, really upset and angry. They were just crying and crying and crying, but sometimes it's a good way to grieve. Protests, just to conclude, are kind of important, fateful moments in people's lives during which they learn new ideas, become involved in new social issues, and form new long-lasting social networks. As scholars have pointed out, protest provides individuals with a rare chance to probe their moral intuitions and articulate or alter their principles. Collectively or publicly, one can take a stand to define one's identity, cry out against injustice. Protest can be a tremendously satisfying part of modern life. It can even become a defining character of one's identity. So just to conclude, understanding the dynamics of the protests is important for getting a clearer picture of how the diaspora now conceives of itself in the post-war environment, and their emotional and communal significance that the 2009 demonstrations will likely be a key turning point for the diaspora going forward. So, thanks.